Hello, everyone. Deborah Neal Baker here with another serious business conversation with the intention to expose, evoke, and evolve our thinking. And today, my guest is, I'm very, very grateful to be having this conversation. Gigi Dunn really supported me this last year and a half, after my late husband Michael's death. And she's been such a great support for me. And she is a board-certified anesthesiologist. However, it's gone way beyond that, and I'm going to let Gigi tell you a little bit about her story and how she got to be where she is today. Hi, Gigi.
Hello, Deborah. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And hello to all of you. My story is a little bit different. As Deborah said, I'm a board-certified anesthesiologist, and I practiced for about 20 years doing that. I did a lot of really intense anesthesia. Neuroanesthesia, I worked with neonatal ICU babies, I did a lot of burn anesthesia. I started a group in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and we grew that group from 4 to about 15 physicians in a really short period of time. So I was serving in a management role. I was the managing partner of that. We put together a big merger with the group in New Orleans over time. So I was co-president of a big group of 50 anesthesia providers. From the beginning of all of that trajectory, I knew that I would do two paths. I didn't know what the second calling would be. I knew that I needed to keep doing the first calling and that the second would emerge. And so it did. As an anesthesiologist and a physician, I was never taught a single day in medical school of health and well-being. We were really experts at dealing with disease, but we didn't learn anything about how to prevent disease other than, the basic things. And so I was fascinated by that. The other thing that happened is that fairly early on in my life, I had a divorce, which ended up being an enormous gift. Because at that point, I decided that I wanted to do some deeper emotional work as well. So it put me in the circumstance where every day I was in the operating room, and with anesthesia, patients with all different subspecialties come to the operating room. So as I was learning, both physically from everything I could read to get my hands on about how to evoke health, and from the emotional side of the therapy and all of that I was going through, I was learning all of the different components of well-being, not just the things that we normally focus on. So as time went by, I realized that the second calling was absolutely going to be what was already my passion, which is to raise awareness and consciousness, not just about health and well-being, because while that's important, we want more than just health. I like to say we don't want health because we don't want a chemotherapy needle in our arm. We want health and well-being because we're here to know who we are authentically at our core, and hopefully to give back in service of the greater good, whatever is our own unique mission in the world. So that's the reason why we need well-being.
Well, and if for the audience, for people listening, the reason that I invited Gigi here to have this conversation is we all, what she's done for the healthcare industry and the healthcare providers, I see it so parallel with what our industry is about, and that is about caring for people. Although it's different, yet there's a lot of similarities. And I know that we all experience our own degree of mental and emotional dis-ease, from anxiety all the way to schizophrenia. And it's not a steady state. It can be quite a roller coaster ride. So knowing that our industry has such intimate conversations and relationships with our customers, I think it's so incredibly important that we all, especially the hairdresser, the beauty professional, the service provider, learns how to really take care of themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's profoundly important. And part of my own learning was I did a fellowship, a 2-year fellowship. I left anesthesiology and did a 2-year fellowship in integrative medicine through Dr. Andrew Weil's Center for Integrative Medicine. As a result of that, I learned the importance of what we do with each moment of our day. You know, we want to mindfully decide how we're going to do the different tasks that we go through every day, focusing on not just mind and body, but spirit as well. We've all been through some really intense times recently, and part of what I am here to talk about today is not just the mental and emotional well-being that contributes so much to our overall well-being, but particularly with a focus on trauma, because that's the part that is really being missed in society. So if we look at what is going on with respect to societal challenges, we can look at the escalation of chronic disease that's so apparent to everyone. We can look at issues with maternal mortality. We can look at the epidemic of sexual trauma and domestic violence. We can look at the epidemic of the opioid crisis. All of this is coming in onto the healthcare profession, and it's causing an epidemic, even pre-COVID, of burnout in our healthcare professionals. And so that's one of the areas where my work went early. After I retrained, I developed 4 programs, all under the umbrella of Simple Wisdom for the Journey. But the work has really focused in the last few years on healthcare professional well-being because of the burnout crisis. Mm-hmm. And what we find is that even in those areas, trauma is underlying so much of what's going on with burnout. And I think it's true in your industry as well. There is a huge amount of trauma that underlies the anxiety and depression. And one of the things that's so important for people to realize is that if you recognize the underlying trauma, which is crucial, it has an impact on how you go about addressing it. Because psychiatry, neuropharmacology absolutely have their place, but we know so much now about trauma and cutting-edge neuroscience that informs trauma-informed care. And that's the part that needs to get out to the general public. And you know, you might be wondering, well, why am I not hearing about this from my healthcare professionals? Well, for one thing, they're massively traumatized right now too, but for another, there's an enormous lag between when we get science, you know, from the bench, to when it actually comes into our own medical care. There can be sometimes between an 18 and 21 year lag between when we know things and when it's actually filtering down into our healthcare system.
Well, I've been hearing just really in the last couple years about trauma. Mm-hmm. And when I started to hear about it, and really I heard about it from you when you were supporting me. Mm-hmm. And it's like, of course. And when I thought about my own situation and Michael's situation and a lot of people, and I'm like, oh my gosh, trauma is really probably at the source of this.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And before COVID, we had what we're learning so much about, 3 different kinds of trauma. So there's trauma that we typically think of, which is battlefield trauma. But part of what Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's work, who's a psychiatrist, Harvard trained, who is really the godfather of the trauma research field, what his work has proven is that we have massive amounts of trauma in our civilian populations. I mean, the numbers are absolutely astonishing. When you look at just things like rape, when you look at childhood developmental trauma, when you look at the amount of trauma that underlies addiction, it's mind-boggling almost. And so it's wonderful that this is now coming to the forefront. If there is a good thing that's coming from COVID, what is happening is because there's going to be post-COVID PTSD, this is forcing the trauma conversation and awareness into the general population now, and also into our healthcare providers. I can't tell you the number of healthcare providers that don't know anything about this.
So first it's the awareness.
Yes.
And I guess, of course, immediately I want to go to, okay, so how can we create our own awareness? What do we each need to do for ourselves? And then how do we do it? What's the care protocol for for each of us, and then collectively?
Yeah. Well, luckily there are some phenomenal books that people will read. So a seminal book on all of this is Dr. Bessel van der Kolk wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's not written just for healthcare professionals. It is written for the general public.
Yeah, y'all, she gave that to me as a gift, and I read it, and as soon as I started reading it, I was like, it was like all this, these insights came about. And in fact, I've gone so far as to enroll in some of their online, that is, you get credits.
That's right.
Professionals get credits for it,
That's right.
but the general public can sign up and listen and participate too.
Absolutely. It's amazing, the work that they are doing. There are 2 books I have huge respect for people who can take very complex topics and boil them down into something that's very simple and relatable. There's a psychologist called Dr. Lynn Karjala, Karjala. She wrote 2 books. One is called Healing Everyday Trauma, and it describes beautifully what trauma is, how you go about addressing it. The other is called Trauma and Dissociation, because you've talked about going from anxiety and depression all the way to schizophrenia and the continuum. And so there really is a continuum there. And by the way, there's a new field that's looking at how much of schizophrenia may actually be dissociative identity disorder as a result of underlying trauma. And you would wonder, well, how in the world could we not have known that before? Well, keep in mind how new the trauma research field is. I mean, Bessel van der Kolk started doing this research in the 1970s. And so really, truly, it's only been in the last 20 years or so when we've been able to have real-time functional MRI scanning and the ability to measure neurotransmitters and all sorts of things like that that have absolutely raised awareness. But there are lots of trauma resources. The other one we talked about earlier is Dr. Gabor Mate, who is a Canadian physician, has just released a phenomenal series on trauma called The Wisdom of Trauma. At some point they're going to put up the link for you to look at, but there's an 1.5-hour documentary in which he completely turns the way we look at addiction on its head. And he talks about the fact that trauma is not what happened to you, it's how your body responds and is continuing to respond.
So you said how your body.
That's right.
You didn't say how your mind.
That's right. That is exactly right.
So say more about that.
Yeah, and so I want to start with stress, because when I teach about this, I talk about the continuum from stress to traumatic stress. So we all know the idea of running from a tiger. So we have normal stress response. We have, the body innately knows, and it's governed by our brainstem and our midbrain, not the brain that we're interacting with right now. The body knows how to get away from threats. And what happens is, very quickly in nanoseconds, we turn on a physiologic reaction. We increase our heart rate, we increase our blood pressure, all in order to get blood flow to our muscles, and we dilate our pathways to our lungs so we can get more oxygen. All of these things are to help us go into something called fight or flight so that we can get away. Now, we also know there's another side to that. There's fight or flight, but there's also a hypovegetative state. So if we can't get away, if we're a young child, for instance, and we can't get away, then there's a hypovegetative state. The first one is hyperarousal, the other is hypoarousal. And so there's fight or flight, or there's collapse, freeze and collapse. So we're learning more about that. And when we talk about trauma, we need to recognize there are 3 kinds of trauma. There's shock trauma, which would be what I just described. There's a single event in which something really overwhelming happens, or there's developmental trauma. And we're learning that that can almost be way more detrimental. And it can be single traumatic events or a lot of traumatic events, but it can also be neglect. It doesn't even have to be outright abuse. And when we talk about neglect, I want to talk a little bit about the 3rd kind of trauma in relation to that, which is generational trauma. What we now know from the field of epigenetics, which is, it's not all about our genes, that there are things that control how our genes express in our environment. We now know that there's a strong likelihood that through epigenetic mechanisms, trauma can be passed through at least 3 generations. Wow. And it doesn't have to be severely traumatic events in that way. It can be that when we have trauma, I want to go back to what I described about stress. When we have trauma, rather than that stress response turning off and us going into rest and digest when we've gotten away from whatever the threat was, trauma makes us pause. And if it's severe enough, it gets stored in our brain in a different place. It's not stored as a whole memory. It can be stored as fragments. But what happens is it animates our nervous system to stay in fight or flight, which is significant. And so now you start to look at all of the things that go on with your heart and your lungs and your metabolism and reproduction and your immunity and all of that. And trauma is fueling all that. I want to speak for a minute about what goes on with the immune system. So we have two kinds of immunity. One is innate immunity, which is inflammation, this is what repairs a wound. In caveman times, that was what was going to cause us harm. Or there's adaptive immunity, which is what we think about as immune surveillance for things like strep or cancer or whatever. When we're under threat, the surveillance immunity gets turned off and the inflammatory immunity goes sky high. Why do we care? We care because at the heart of almost all of our chronic diseases is inflammation.
Yeah, inflammation is
inflammation.
You certainly have been hearing about inflammation.
That is exactly right.
And disease.
Inflammation and disease. And so there's that continuum that goes on. And so with trauma, that is staying turned on all the time. And it can lead to, may I read?
Absolutely.
Here are some of the things that may happen. Let's use COVID as the example. Let's say that we have COVID-induced PTSD, which most of us are going to have some form of. It'll be a continuum, but most of us will have some form of that. I have to tell you, as I was making these slides for one of the programs I teach to physicians, I was a little concerned about how many of these seemed a little too close for comfort, in spite of all the things I do. So, difficulty sleeping, anxiety, feeling chronically overwhelmed, eating more or less, social withdrawal, work-related nightmares, feeling more cynical or pessimistic, difficulty concentrating, feeling flat, no energy, time, or motivation for self-care, difficulty making decisions, worry, rumination, feelings of despair and hopelessness, feeling pessimistic or cynical, difficulty trusting others, irritability, reduced enjoyment, competence in work, increased sense of isolation, increased illness and pain, increased fear for the safety for others, increased sensitivity to sounds, smells, lighting, and then increased reliance on food, alcohol, recreational or medicinal products in order to manage emotional pain, and then returning to old behaviors and habits that maybe you thought you had left long gone. And so what happens is trauma is a physioneurosis. So our body is telling us that something is wrong. It's telling us through these uncomfortable feelings that we need to address something. And here's one of the things that's so important. First of all, we're very resilient. The brain is very resilient. We can learn what to do and we can counter all of this. Secondly, if these felt a little too close for comfort, really simple things people can do in their daily routine for self-care, self-compassion, in order to begin to address this. If there is a continuum whereby people are feeling like things need to be escalated a little bit, it's profoundly important to seek out trauma-informed care, which we can talk about in a little bit. But the good news is there are really simple things that can be done. One of the things that's important to know is that if you're dealing with trauma, the medications can either, the medications may not do exactly what we want them to do. And talk therapy, while it has its place, oh my goodness, I'm a huge supporter of that. But the research is showing, based on what goes on in the brain and trauma, that talk therapy will not make these danger signals in the body go away. It's got its limit because it's not coming from our neocortex. This is coming from the lower areas of the brain. So the therapies have to be body-based therapies. So imagine the computer dialogue box that's going whatever. That's the way trauma does with our nervous system. And no amount of talking through insight is going to make that midbrain and brainstem response go away. You have to involve the body in trauma-related therapies.
So when you say you have to involve the body, what does that look like?
So what it looks like is, first of all, basic self-care, which I can talk about in a minute. But the other thing is there are top-down approaches which start to work with the neocortex. There is a place for things like mindfulness and yoga and that sort of thing. But then there are bottom-up things to address, which start, once again, with the brainstem and the midbrain. And it can be easy things that are rhythmic. You know, the ancient indigenous peoples already know a lot of this. Things like, now there's research that supports all this. You read Bessel van der Kolk's book and he talks about all of this. Psychotrauma, dancing, drumming, choral singing. You can do things as simple as tapping in certain places. All of these are things you can do on your own. And
even listening to music.
Certain music, certain kinds of music. There's sound therapy. When I teach the programs I teach, I do resources that talk about, and I let people experience different kinds of sound therapy. It's profoundly important. Trauma-informed yoga. You know, that's an example of the way you would work with the body in a little bit of a different way. There's certain poses that are really good for trauma, and there are books on all of that. And then, if people need to go a little bit further, there are all sorts of evidence-based trauma-informed therapists and therapies.
So they are, those kind of people, those trauma specialists, they are out there.
They're out there. They're absolutely out there, but you have to know to look for them. And you would think,
so do you see that? So if you're looking for, you know, you're doing research on a psychologist or a psychiatrist, how will you know that they address trauma?
Well, sometimes they will write it on the website, but then this is where doing a little bit of your own homework makes a huge difference. When you've read Bessel van der Kolk's book, he talks a lot about the different therapies and modalities that work, as does Gabor Mate. But there are things like, I want to use an example of EMDR, eye movement dissociation reprocessing. EMDR is a trauma therapy. Now, the research shows that it is good in adults for sort of shock trauma, like the single event. It doesn't do much in developmental trauma. EFT, emotional freedom technique, is a tapping technique. I think the VA now pays for that for PTSD in our veterans. So there's research that supports that. Neurofeedback is another modality that the research is coming in really good on. There is another form of therapy called internal family systems. Dr. Richard Schwartz developed all of that. So you can look for an IFS practitioner. And there's another one that I think is going to be absolutely phenomenal. It's in really early research stages now, but it's holographic memory resolution. It came out of the addiction world. So the person that invented that took a whole lot of different modalities, integrated them, and it's after all of the work he had done as an addictions counselor and all of that. So research is that's in early clinical trials now.
Yeah, is that kind of referring to, because, you know, I know that, you know, the use of psychedelics and hallucinogenics and ketamine treatments, and there's so that's part of that, what you just spoke about.
That is different. So I was going to get to that too.
Okay.
Exactly what you just talked about is having really good research as well. What is important, though, is what is going to be trauma for the masses? You know, because this is more than, and also, how do you make it affordable for people? Because neurofeedback, getting insurance companies to pay for that, the psychedelics and all of that.
So where do we go and what do we do?
And so it gets right back to, you can start with the simpler things first and then work your way. So how do you create a healthier daily practice? And one of the things that people can do immediately is begin to do some form of a contemplative practice, because it interrupts that fight or flight response. Now, for people with trauma, it's important to recognize that your regular meditations and mindfulness may be really difficult to do, because imagine this, you've spent your entire life with something below the surface, you have run or shopped or done drugs or sex or whatever the addiction is, to keep all of that from coming up to the surface. And now you're supposed to sit by yourself in a room with your eyes closed. That could trigger the
Yes.
trauma. Absolutely. And so the contemplative practices that people can do when there is trauma underlying is guided imagery. And I want to give a resource for that right now. Belle Ruth Naparstik is the godmother of guided imagery. The research on her work is so good. It's in probably 2,000 different medical clinics and settings. Kaiser Permanente, the big healthcare behemoth on the West Coast, bought her entire library and put it on their website for free. So you can go to you can Google Kaiser Permanente Guided Imagery Podcast, and you can find about 20 of free podcasts of hers. That's one way. Walking meditation is another thing. For people with trauma, walking is a really important thing to do. Yoga is another really good thing to do. And one of the most basic, but I think healing things at all, is time in nature.
Yeah.
Time in nature makes a huge difference. If we'll just spend 5 or 10 minutes in nature every day, listening to the sounds and just being still, it makes an enormous difference.
Wow. I mean, I could usually in these conversations, I'm talking more, but I'm so intrigued with your information because it is so new, and it's so critical.
Well, it's critical, and the other thing that's so important is to destigmatize it. Because truly, when you look at the numbers, I was astonished when I read the numbers that Bessel van der Kolk quoted in his book that were from the Centers for Disease Control. I mean, first of all, you are not alone if you're having troubles with these things. Now, post-COVID, we're all having a lot more company. The healthcare professionals are having an enormous challenge. And what's really important to know, Oprah Winfrey has just put a book out on all of this, and she talks about not saying what's wrong with you, but what happened to you.
Right.
And this is where we get back to the generational trauma, you know?
So even our language needs to shift.
Our language needs to shift.
Our self-talk and how we talk to each other and the words we use. So I'm curious because, having had, breast cancer and then after my Edwin, passed, and then having Michael leave the way he did, and you talk about trauma, is it possible that trauma is at the core of physical disease?
Yes, it absolutely is. And that's the reason why we have to put this into conscious awareness. And not only that, it's at the core of physical dis-ease, which leads to disease. It's at the core, but also, when I use the term spiritual, I don't mean religious. I don't mean a religious connotation. I mean an awareness and consciousness. Gabor Mate's work talks about this as the way for our own evolution. For our own walk here in life, that trauma can absolutely be the way that we find our purpose in life, that we find our greater purpose in life.
Well, isn't it always that whole saying that adversity is really equals growth?
Absolutely.
I mean, it creates growth.
It absolutely does.
So a lot of people listening are probably salon owners and managers. And so we're in an industry, we're in a business that people are highly creative and they're empathic.
Right, absolutely.
And they, have their trauma that they bring to work.
Exactly.
And then they are with people all day long that probably are bringing their trauma and dis-ease to the salon and in the chair. So what do we need to, what do salon owners and leaders, people that are really responsible for leading a group of people, what should they be looking for? How should they be acting? What should they be doing to support
Well, first
their
of all,
people?
yeah, well, first of all, you hit on in the very beginning, which is awareness, knowing all the things I read about and what to start looking for, having an environment of acceptance and support. So knowing that if people are having struggles, that they can absolutely come to them. And then I think it is really key to have a good well-being program. You know, it's really important to know how to send people to the places where they can learn how to be healthy and well. And I believe in systemic well-being initiatives. That's part of what my work is right now that I'm doing with the healthcare professionals. How do you have systemically a program that supports the continuum from just regular well-being to stress, to distress, to downright trauma? How do you have a generalized systemic program that supports all of that so that within that people feel comfortable even if they're at the very far end of having experienced vicarious trauma now, because that's really what we're talking about.
I mean, I hear you, Gigi, and I appreciate that. But I mean, we're talking about salons, and so a well-being program. What would a well-being program look like for a salon of 20 hairdressers, as an example?
Well, and so part of what I see the need for, not just salons, but generally,
Yes.
is just an education program. This is not everybody's got to have their own individual well-being program, but there needs to be an integrated education program that teaches people generally how to live any part of their day in a healthier way, which will include what are your thoughts and emotions doing to support your health and well-being, what are all the practices that you can work into an already really, really busy day, and how do those practices inform support for trauma. So really, it's more just a systemic education.
I'm wondering too, since now we're out of the pandemic, for the most part, and maybe people will start having staff meetings again, and they'll be gathering again, and maybe look in your community and invite a mental health professional to come in and do a 30-minute talk at a staff meeting, and just for me, it's then just have resources. If nothing else, have resources where you can refer people to. But I think that what you mentioned is about creating the salon as a sanctuary and a safe place is, and look, our industry is in the best opportunity to do that.
Absolutely.
Because of the nature of the work.
Absolutely you are. And so not only for the clients that come in, but for the people that work there, having that nurturing environment. And then some of it is understanding that vicarious trauma is a very real thing. You mentioned the fact that the people that work in the salon are very empathic. And so imagine, just like with healthcare professionals, every single day, all day, every day, people are coming in, they're sharing some of their most intimate life stories with the person who is working with them. And if you're really empathic, you can take that on. And so it's profoundly important to have daily self-care rituals. I'm going to say the word rituals, so that except on your busiest days, you honor that. Because when you come to work in a more grounded way, a more self-compassionate way, then you're able to listen and hear differently, so that you're listening, you're very compassionate with the person in your chair, but you're not taking all that on. As we do our own grounding, our own healing, we're able to establish healthier boundaries so that we're present, but not present in taking on whatever is coming from the person and their own trauma. We know a lot about nervous system co-regulation. So trauma dysregulates the nervous system. I talked about the fact that we stay in fight or flight all the time. When someone does their own grounding, their own self-care practices, their own contemplative practices, and they've got their nervous system in a more regulated place, we know from interpersonal neurobiology that the person sitting next to them will have more co-regulation.
So the entrainment,
that is
concept.
exactly right. It is exactly that. Profoundly important.
Wow, it's so I can't help but reflect on my own experience with my life, and how much habits,
Yes.
if you don't want to call them rituals, the habits that we have, and like my first hour in the morning when I wake up. It's so kind of, for the healthcare worker or the hairdresser, the service provider, sometimes they're the last person that they take care of.
That's right. Yes.
And one of the things that's happened as a result, I think, of the pandemic that's really, really highlighted how much people appreciate the beauty professional.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
It's been,
yes.
we always knew it, but now it's become so apparent to the point where I've read articles. I read an article in Vogue, this last issue of Vogue, and this article was written by, whoever wrote the article was referring to their hairdresser as beloved, their beloved beauty therapist, and how much they had missed that touch and that conversation with that person.
Yes.
So that's not going to happen if the service provider, if the beauty professional isn't taking care of themselves too.
That is exactly right. And the other thing that's important to note here is one of those bottom-up approaches is touch. Touch is crucially important. And so that exchange, that healing exchange, is going on between the professional and the client.
In the same article, I thought it was interesting because I hadn't heard Patricia Field's name in a couple decades. And now, because she's the science of touch, and so now people are so attuned to how necessary that is.
I can tell some really, if you would like, I can start to go through how you might work in to your regular day some healthy practices.
Absolutely.
Okay,
please.
Part of what I do at this point is I don't only work with healthcare professionals, but with healthcare professionals who I absolutely teach, you've got to teach them how to do it when they have about a nanosecond, when there's no time.
Right.
But healthcare professionals aren't the only busy people in the world. Everybody's busy in this world. And so everybody needs to know, how do you work this in without it adding hours to your day? And so first of all, first thing when you wake up in the morning, you can put your attention on your breath. You can make your breath slower, deeper, quieter, and more regular. And by doing just a few breathing techniques like that, you're stimulating that rest and digest side of your nervous system. As you go through your morning, if you can pick out some inspirational reading that you do each morning in less than 5 minutes. So I happen to love the Mark Nepo's Book of Awakening. It's a reading that's about a page a day, and it goes for 365 days. And it's so good, I'm probably on my 5th year through. So some form of inspirational reading. Think about your day ahead and think about where you might be able to put in moments. It doesn't have to be an hour. Moments of self-nurture. Is there a place in between clients where you can go, close the door, close your eyes, and for 2 or 3 minutes have quiet time? And I'll talk about some things you can do with that in a minute. In the shower or the bath, if you do that in the morning, turn your attention to your breath and then quiet your mind and see what kind of guidance for your day comes in. So much of this is about learning stillness and how do we allow time for I call it our own internal GPS. How do we let our own internal GPS give us guidance? The whole nutrition thing is a whole different conversation, so I'm not going to go into that right now.
However, it is important.
It is profoundly important.
I want to remind everyone that is
important.
Very important.
I will talk about that for just a second. The research is absolutely with the anti-inflammatory eating pattern. I don't like to call it diet. The research is clear that the diets don't work. They do not work. They do not work because they do not last long term. anti-inflammatory has 12,800,000 study participants that showed decreased mortality of all types. That mortality is death. Decreased mortality from heart trouble, decreased mortality from cancer, impact on the neurodegenerative diseases, which are things like Parkinson's and dementia and things like that. And the beauty of that was 5 years later, people were still eating that way. If you want a good resource on nutrition, I think one of the best things I've ever read is Michael Pollan's book, In Defense of Food.
Yeah. Eat
food. If your great-grandmother doesn't recognize it as food, it's a food-like substance. Don't put it in your mouth. Mostly plants, not too much.
Yeah, I remember years of the rainbow. Yes, eat a rainbow.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Make a rainbow on your happy plate. It's exactly true.
And nothing with an ingredient label.
Nothing. That is exactly right. How do you get other contemplative practices in? So there are two people that I recommend in terms of music and sound. One is David Eisen. He's worked with the National Institute of Health to validate his musical composition's ability to impact anxiety, depression, pain. So David Eisen, I-S-O-N. You can download some of his work.
We will somehow, you are giving us so many resources, yes. Somehow we will figure out how to share that with
yes,
our audience so that, because yes. I'm sure that they, yes. Yes. Trying to take notes.
Yes, I will.
So somehow we will do that.
I will absolutely do that.
Yes, we'll put it on the YouTube page.
Okay, so David Eisen's work is just beautiful. You can get it from SoundsTrue.com. You can put that on your cell phone, and if you have a break between clients, you can put in your earbuds, and literally for 3 minutes, you can listen to that and evoke the relaxation response. The other person who does wonderful work with sound therapy, who was a real pioneer, is Steve Halpern.
Yeah,
I love his work. Movement. How do you get movement in? Well, the newer research is showing you do not have to do, in my time coming up, it was like, do intense aerobic exercise for an hour every day. And no, you don't need to do that. Walking is an amazing way to get phenomenal health benefits. If you will walk 30 minutes on most days, and it doesn't have to be all at one time. If people are in a place where their salon is, that they can, maybe part of their lunch, they can eat and then walk around the building for 10 minutes. If at all possible, if you can walk in nature, the research on the boost to the immune system shows that time in nature is much better for your immune system than walking indoors, but walking indoors is better than nothing. You can always close the door and do 10 push-ups. There are all sorts of ways. You can take the stairs instead of the elevator. You can park at the edge of the shopping center and walk in. There, if you are flying, you can walk while you're waiting. There are ways if you're.
So it doesn't have to be that difficult.
No, it can be so very.
All of these things have gotten more simple. Because like you, it was the intense workouts, which really was probably a lot of the reason people didn't want to exercise, because that was what was being promoted. But now it's so much more gentle. We're being more gentle with ourselves.
And that's part of what trauma therapy is.
Yeah.
Self-compassion. Gratitude goes a long way. For people who may want to journal, just sitting down and writing, and it doesn't have to be just gratitude. Given what's gone on with all of us, the loss and the trauma we've all had, you may just want to sit down and see what comes up. I was doing a seminar with a group of ICU and emergency room nurses a couple of weeks ago, and I gave them only 15 minutes. I said, just go outside and sit. You can either walk in nature or write. One of the nurses said, I went to tears so quickly, and I didn't realize what all was suppressed just as I started to write. Your subconscious will offer up all sorts of things with just a simple journaling practice. The other thing that's so important to say with all of this, and with trauma in particular, is we've got to clear our emotions. We will spend a huge amount of time. Trauma is not that it happened. It's what happens to our bodies, and then how much of our life we spend trying to avoid.
Suppressing
it.
Or trying to forget it, or deny it happened. No, I've always been a person that, and I'm sure that's, because I had my own childhood trauma, but I have always just allowed my emotions, what I always say, to flow through me.
Yes.
If I need to cry, I don't care if I'm in front of 1,800 people at
Yes.
Serious Business. I'll cry.
Yes, it's profoundly
It's amazing too. I just want to encouraging people to let their emotions out. It's amazing how different you feel when you allow the emotions to flow instead of trying to suppress them.
Right.
Suppressing emotions is actually painful.
It is.
You can get so stuck. I always say you get basically like emotionally constipated.
That's exactly it.
And so, yeah, I think that you've got, I'm just so grateful
Well, I'm
that
grateful.
you are here sharing all this with, and I would love to, share you and your wisdom with our audience another time. I can't wait for people to hear. And like I said, y'all, we will get all of these resources that Gigi has shared with us. So do you want to say anything in closing that
I think,
you haven't said?
yes, I think it's important to end by saying that while we've all been through a huge amount, that there's absolutely COVID-induced PTSD that we need to know about and know what to do with. At the end of the day, it's not a heavy message. It is a profoundly hopeful and empowering message, because once you know about this and know what to do, the steps moving forward are so much easier than avoiding all of this. And then you can truly be on the way to healing your life.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Gigi.
Thank you.
And thank you all for tuning in. And hopefully we will see you at Serious Business or virtually when it comes up in January 22. And please check us out on YouTube. We've got other conversations that we've had. And thank you very much. Thank you,
Thank
Gigi.
you.